Chapter 12. Lugnskog. Honestly, I don't know how it could have been any easier. Maddie Tuck's voice was like nails on a chalkboard, bouncing off the concrete walls of the locker room. I thought it was high stakes, one of her friends was arguing. Oh, it was, Maddie returned. That doesn't mean it was dangerous. Margo had no idea if Maddie knew the details of her squad's involvement in the mission now past, but she shot Margo a look when she added, Some other squad chickened out at the last minute. What? Why? Good question, Maddie boasted. Like I said, there was no real danger. Once we were in the building, it was an easy planting the bugs and getting out of there. It's not like we had to kill the guy. The mission in question had seen the toppling of an Indian tech CEO after a tape of one of his private conversations was leaked by the IREA. Maddie was right. No guns, no danger. Possibly the easiest mission they could have missed out on with technical stakes. All thanks to Emma, now Margo got to spend her days hearing Maddie Tuck brag about her success throughout practice, watch the rest of the squad prepare for something even less impressive in Arizona, and hear Kent and Siobhan complain that Margo had no reason to opt out of their new assignment. If things had ended a few weeks earlier, there would have been no issue. At present, all she cared about was moving herself up the depth chart. So long as she was padding her stats against lesser teams, she was keeping her mind away from Wyatt. And since she was joining Emma and opting out of the Arizona mission, that meant less time confronted with the reality of her standing with Riley. Hockey was her best chance at escape, even if that meant biding her time and putting up with the likes of Maddie Tuck. Dressed in her gear from the waist down, Margo ignored the other girls the way she knew best. Pulling out her phone, she framed her upper half just enough to look interested before flashing her eyes off screen. A few different captions could have accompanied the picture, but she settled on, "Save me," figuring that was likely to garner the most responses. They came flying back almost instantaneously. It was shocking how unoriginal most boys were with their returns. At least a dozen replies were of similar pictures, all captioned with the uninspiring promise of deal. Whether that was worse than the opposite alternative was open for debate. There was nothing cute about desperation, and between the amount of guys offering conditional responses or seeing this as their only chance to lay their feelings on the line for her, Margo was tempted to delete the app altogether. But every once in a while a reply would challenge her expectations, or even make her laugh at herself, and that made the whole exercise worth it. Dylan Holtzauer, who'd been short with her since she rejected him the year prior, gave her favorite response of the afternoon, offering, "Maybe you should do something you actually care about." It was a slap in the face, not because it made her change how she felt about hockey as a hobby, but because even as her favorite pastime, it still required so much pushing of her patience. There was nothing in the world that made her happy without conditions anymore. Opening one too many explicit replies, Margo sighed and put her phone away, finishing her preparation for their afternoon practice. After that weekend's obliteration of Italy, she was hopeful her skills might finally be noticed enough to move her up to varsity. There was no one else above her on JV, and given how many times Erica Ritterstad was forcing turnovers at the blue line, it was only a matter of time until sense overcame seniority. If the coaches wanted any chance at a competitive second semester, they would have to move Margo up. Blair's attitude had her hopeful. Not that she was one to lay out her secrets. Staying in the closet was evident enough of that. The team captain had shown an increasing favoritism to Margo ever since they'd begun traveling. There was a difference between the pity she showed the other friendless girls. With Margo, it came across as less of a chore and more of a curiosity. It helped that one of her own missions had taken her to West Africa, meaning that, as little as she had retained, Blair still made an effort to communicate in French when there was time. At practice, however, it was all English, and Grace Haverford had missed a clean pass directly on her stick. "What the hell was that?" Blair screamed from the far wall. Grace kept her head down, shrugging off the complaint and finding her way to the back of the drill line. The ignorance clearly rubbed the captain the wrong way. "Hey, Snips, eyes up when I'm talking to you." Grace followed the command, clearly struggling to keep her eyes from rolling. "I missed a pass," she waved away. "So what?" "So that's 3 you've let slide," Blair pushed. "Get your head out of your ass." Grace made the mistake of turning her back too early. With a single strong swing, Blair whipped her stick against the top of Grace's, causing it to topple out of her hand onto the ice below. "Wake up, Snips!" Blair bullied. "You're not playing top lines if all you're thinking about is your boyfriend's room this weekend." Grace shoved her away with just the right amount of fire. Blair took it as an improvement. "I'm not playing this weekend," Grace bullied. "Like hell you're not," Blair returned. "Where do you think you're going to be?" Grace had thrown her mouthguard between her teeth, waiting for the next drill, but seeing her progress halted by more questions, pulled it out and spit it on the ice at Blair's feet. "Take a guess, idiot," she swore. "I've got a mission." Before Blair could respond, Grace was back in turn for the drill, this time cleanly catching a pass from Maddie Tuck and sniping a shot against the crossbar. She shrugged in Blair's direction, finding her way to the far line to avoid further interrogation. Blair skated off to talk to one of the assistant coaches. The interaction hung over the rest of practice like a bad smell. Nearly everyone had seen it, and for the half that had not heard the details, it was obvious that something odd had thrown off the captain's plans for that weekend's game. This clearly spilled into the plans of the coaches. Immediately after practice, Grace was pulled aside and failed to return to the locker room until the other girls were long since dressed. Even that weekend's lineup was delayed until after Margo had finished her shower. When she was dressed, seated on the bench and waiting for one of the other girls to check their phone first, Coach Klein finally walked in with the corrected lineup card. "Blair," she gestured, pulling the captain to her feet at the center of the room. "All right," Blair read, having calmed down from before. "Lines against Canada. Petey between the pipes, Daffo on the bench." The girls gave a single clap for the announcement, the way they always did. "Front three, Harrow, Benny, and Cargill, followed by me, Tanner, and Baki. Then Whites, Des, and Lauer, and Carly, Stones, and Ritters." Margo felt her breath catch in her throat. If she had heard correctly, the coaches were moving Erica to forward to fill Grace's spot in the lineup. There was no reason for her to prove herself then. The defensive spot was wide open for her taking. "For D, we're rocking Gigi and Nash, Lita and Frankie, and Tuck is going to take Ritter's spot with Alex." As fast as her heartbeat had increased, Margo felt the life ripped out of her chest. As soon as her own surprise subsided, Maddie Tuck let a wide smile fill the red space of her cheeks and glared directly at Margo across the room. She could hardly stand to join the rest of the team in the huddle. No sooner had the coaches exited the room than Margo rushed out to meet them in the hallway. "What else do I have to do?" she screamed. Both coaches must have been expecting it. Klein gave Casey a knowing glance, letting her take the trouble. Margo felt steam pouring from her ears. "Margo," Casey sighed. "I know this is tough, but 16 goals, she interrupted. 16 goals in 7 games. Case, I played defense, for God's sake." "And?" The question caught her off guard. "And?" she repeated, incensed. "Those are Paul Coffey numbers. There's no reason I shouldn't be playing up." The comment put a half smile on the coach's face. "No reason?" she questioned. "Can't you think of one?" Margo felt her own face grow hot. "Oh, come on," she begged. "This can't still be about getting along with the team." Casey crossed her arms, bothered by the implication. "You know, I'm less worried about you getting along with the girls and more concerned with your attitude," she said. "My attitude? You're a skilled player, Dreer, but I'm less concerned about you padding your stats against foreign teams." She gestured toward the locker room door. "Your intensity is inconsistent. Half the time you look bored out of your mind out there, the other half someone catches you off guard and picks your pocket. We can't have that lack of focus screwing up the efforts of 20 other girls." Margo laughed, hardly believing what she was hearing. "So what, you want me to be more aggressive?" she challenged. "I want you to be a team player," Casey returned. "Even when you're not doing everything yourself, you're making it about yourself. Stupid penalties might not cost you the game in JV, but if I let you play varsity, your skills aren't going to make up for a costly woman down." "I can calm down," Margo promised. "I don't want you to calm down," Casey pushed. "I want you to be consistent. Half the games you've played, your attitude drags down the rest of the team. The other girls looked up to you, literally. If you're off your game, I can't let the morale of the entire bench shrink to match yours." Margo had no reply. She stood there trying to figure out more ways of defending herself. Coach Casey had her pinned. "Canada won't be as easy as the other teams have been," Casey finally spoke again. "Plus, I know you have a bone to pick against them. Use it to your advantage and prove to me that you have a cool head. We know you have the skills Tuck doesn't. That doesn't make you a better fit. Prove you can lead." Again, Margo struggled to find her words. But the coach left her behind, tossing a hand against her shoulder and letting her contemplate the approach to that weekend's game. Alone in the hallway, she stared at the copy of the lineup pasted behind her, fixating on Maddie's name until the tension in her jaw gave her a headache. Back in the common room, Kent was alone, suffering in the kitchen. Whatever he was attempting to cook in a pan to add to his pasta was burning so horrifically she could smell it in the outside hallway. He tried to cover it up when she heard the door open, but this only brought a bigger smile to Margo's face. Thankfully, she needed the entertainment. "Don't laugh," he pouted, stopping the fire with a glass lid. "You know, you're the only Italian I know who can't cook," she joked. "I didn't know you knew anymore," he pressed. "You're the only French girl I know who never shuts her mouth." Margo continued laughing. "Was that supposed to be hurtful?" Kent's face matched the red of his sauce. "Shut up." She shrugged. "Okay." Then she stepped up to him and kissed him. All the tension in his shoulders melted, but when he opened his eyes, his deep breath brought a painful shiver. "Don't do that," he frowned. "Why not?" she teased. You liked it. I needed it. Kill two birds with one stone. He leaned back against the edge of the counter. Is this your sign? He asked cautiously. Of course not, she laughed. Then stop doing that, he bugged. I don't like it. For whatever reason, this bothered her more than anything else that had happened all day. Yes, you do, she argued. No, I don't, he pushed back. Stop using me for your own amusement. It broke her heart to think that that was what he thought this was, but there was no way she could explain it to him, little as he understood her. Fine, she relented. Then kiss me back. No, he said forcefully. Kiss me back. Margo, stop! The front door opened, and Emma walked through, bringing with her a chill that froze the entire common room. She hardly acknowledged them as she walked past, but the 10 seconds it took for her to traipse from one door to another had a profound effect on both of them. Kent's eyes followed the girl until her bedroom door closed, giving her the same look of longing Margo was desperate to have herself. Annoyed, she dismissed herself, knowing whatever she was trying to get from him would not be worth the effort. I'm going to shower, she announced, though even this failed to garner her hoped reply. Kent resigned himself to his pasta and sat at the island counter alone. Seeing herself in the mirror was exactly the conclusion her day warranted. Whatever practice had done to her, made worse by her interaction with Kent, her body looked back with the same liveliness as a drowned corpse. Her emaciated frame, which she had taken so much care to correct since the season had started, was a bloated mess, unable to decide whether today's calorie intake had been too much or too little. There was no light behind her eyes. The bags beneath them showed off more color than the rest of her face. Worst of all was her stomach. There were days she'd been hopeful to see the scar from the surgery nearly non-existent in the light of her bathroom, but today was no such day. What few stretch marks she had gained in those brief months were highlighted by the wound below her belly button, a look that reminded her painfully of Liz's arms. Margo had never believed in heaven, but wherever her friend was, wherever he was, too, she was jealous of them both. Luring the boys on her phone did little to improve her mood, especially since Kent's favor was out of the question tonight. Nor did the warmth of her shower do anything to lift her spirits. She was barely passing anatomy. Stuck on that night's assignment for upwards of an hour, she admitted defeat and tried to relax herself to sleep by jumping ahead in math. Calming as this was, she was still crushed by the loneliness of crawling under the covers without someone else. Desperate as she was, she could never cross that line with Kent, especially now that his naivety was lessening. That night she didn't dream. Instead, her weekend flew by in a whirlwind of changes, among which she was desperate to cling to some bit of routine. It began with Xander pulling her aside after fitness, knowing her evening hockey game would keep her out of training. There was a new mission, he announced, and asked for her permission to accept it. Margo's brain had been solely on the game that morning, and determined to keep it that way, basically told Xander where he could shove it, siding with, of all people, Emma, who she knew would stay as far from any mission as possible. Margo's choice was hardly one of solidarity, but understanding that the next 2 weeks would mean more training, more delay of her ability to focus, she was determined to do everything in her power to prove Coach Casey wrong. It was the only thing left that gave her any semblance of drive. She hardly remembered anything of the game. So focused was she not only on maintaining her concentration, but working through some twisted metaphor against her former home country. It was the most selfless game Margo had ever played. They routed the Lumberjacks JV squad by nearly a dozen goals, none of which came from the end of Margo's stick, though she had made the effort to set up 6 on behalf of her teammates. Best of all, one of the Canadian girls tried to enforce her place in Margo's sphere of defense, cracking down on her stick the way Grace had done in practice those weeks before. Instead of retaliating, Margo held her breath and let the broken stick drop to the ice, letting the officials take notice and drawing a 2-minute advantage on behalf of the Americans. The next day, both Kent and Siobhan had called her out for skipping the mission, though even without a confident excuse, Margo doubled down on her decision. Spending an entire day in a van with both Guerin brothers was low on her bucket list these days, especially when that trip required her to travel to the middle of nowhere, do virtually nothing but sit in a bank lobby for an afternoon. Determined that Friday's game against Canada had been the catalyst for her change of status on the team, she was looking forward to spending her free time improving her game more than she already had, even if both Xander and Mrs. Guerin were pressuring her to fix her grades. Monday came with a relaxing wave. Despite knowing the others were upset with her decision, Emma took the majority of the squad's ire, leaving Margo with less pressure than she had expected after Saturday's confrontation. It was obvious Emma still had yet to apologize for her outburst at Siobhan, but knowing her as well as she did, Margo knew how close she was to breaking. Alone for lunch, she decided to join Rachel and Paige at their table. It had been months since she had spoken to any friends outside the squad, and it was nice to have a conversation on something entirely new, even if the girls repeatedly asked how she was doing in the aftermath of all that had happened, subtle as they were with their wording. That had become her identity. Defending what had happened from everyone who looked in her direction. Strangers or friends, it hardly mattered. Margo had become a pariah to anyone who knew even a rumor of her story. When the bell finally let out for training, she was quick to make her way back to the common room. Overlapping the season with the boys' team, this week the girls were back at the city ice complex. And by the time Margo reached the rink, dressed far earlier than anyone else had even arrived, the only youth practice on the schedule had concluded, leaving her alone to scratch the surface until the rest of the team joined her. The hour and a half that followed was more difficult than she had anticipated. Without anyone to challenge her, Margo was able to push herself as hard as she physically could, bound only by the confines of time, which moved even slower than a normal practice. She worked her way through the usual drills, practicing her shot accuracy before boring of pucks and focusing on her footwork. Time still dragged, but eventually the clock reached 4:30, and trusting the coaches had arrived early, she cleaned up her supplies and wandered back to the locker room for her second shower of the day. Her body had changed since Thursday. Her heart rate flying from the ice time, the image reflected in the locker room mirror had a color in her cheeks, a determined look in her eyes. Even her scar, pained as it was after the workout, looked smaller. Margo couldn't help but laugh while she had the space to herself. Whatever she had done on the ice, she looked good for a change. If time alone every afternoon for the next 2 weeks were possible, she could hardly wait to see what she looked like when the others came back from Arizona. Soon as she was out of the shower, however, something was clearly wrong. The girls were starting to arrive, but there was a cloud hanging over every person that entered, one that should not have succeeded a victory over Canada. Blair was seated in her usual spot beside the door, hardly raising her eyes off the floor as she dressed from only the waist down. Margo was redressed in her soggy gear by the time they usually started their practice, but no one else had moved. Confused, she waited in silence, trying to piece together what was going on. It wasn't until Maddie Tuck entered with the coaches, none in anything more than pants and tennis shoes, that Margo understood the mood of the room. Maddie took her seat next to Sasha Bachmeyer and collapsed into tears, her face in her hands. Margo almost felt sorry for her. "I'm sure you've all heard the news by now," Klein started. "Grace didn't make it back from Germany." Maddie let out an extended wail from her seat. "I know a lot of you were close with her," Klein continued. "She was a smart hockey player and a bold personality, and some of you have been through this before, but it's never easy when one of our own gives it all in service to the company." Margo looked around the room and caught Christine staring emotionlessly at the floor. As much as she hated the girl, it was difficult to imagine losing a friend that close on a mission without being part of it herself. The closest she had to that were Rachel and Paige, but even then, Margo didn't think their loss would hit her as hard as this was clearly hitting Grace's friends. Maddie had hardly breathed. "Something like this is bigger than hockey," Casey picked up. "I know some of you want nothing more than to distract yourself with the game, but sometimes it's healthier to take time off and mourn if that's what you have to do. No one here is going to blame you for reflecting on the week, especially since we're hosting Japan this weekend. None of us are worried about dropping a non-conference game if it benefits the health of everyone on the team." Margo's heart started racing. Criminal as it might be, the look on Maddie's face gave the distinct impression that she would not be playing Friday's game. Unless the coaches valued Margo's skills even less than they said they did, a single shift in the lineup meant she was finally playing varsity. She tried not to let her smile show. While the rest of the team spent practice turned down a notch, Margo only increased her intensity. The best part of her day came during a weave drill, when one of her shots ricocheted off the post and drilled Maddie clean in the side of the head. A wave of gasps echoed around the glass as the other girl collapsed to the ground in an increase of tears. Out of obligation, Margo skated over and reached a hand down, only to have it swatted away. "Fine," Margo muttered, eager to get back in line. "I'll do it again, then." She didn't catch who, but the harsh sounds of, "What the hell is wrong with you?" ripped against her back. The coaches didn't confirm her place in the lineup until Thursday, with the extended announcement that technology failure was delaying their game to Saturday afternoon. All the better, she thought, determined to study tape from her game against Canada in her free time Friday evening. Kent didn't return home until 9 that night. Thankfully, this meant the time that she'd been able to spend with Siobhan and Riley in the common room was left untainted by his sulking. The other two had long since gone to bed by the time he came through the door. "Hey," she waved from the couch, giving him space. "How was driving?" "Fine," he huffed. She wasn't going to let him slip away that easily. "Are you going to take the test again this weekend?" "I don't know," he scowled. "If there's time." She held her tongue, not willing to remind him of the need for an appointment. "You look like you could use a nerd date instead." His brown eyes finally made it as far as the couch. She smiled at his pathetic attitude. They're not dates, he argued. All right, she teased. Nerdy hangout sessions, or whatever it is you two get up to these days. Kent kicked his shoe so hard against the rack, a number of the other pairs tumbled into the entryway. She has a boyfriend, he reminded her. Right. That weird kid in anatomy who smells like cheese, she remembered. You've told me. He moved toward the couch, letting his height speak for itself. Are you done? He pushed. Of course not. Then what's the end goal? He tried to decipher. I've told you 1,000,000,000 times I don't have feelings for Morgan. I will never have feelings for Morgan. All right, Margo shrugged, smirking. Whatever you say. Shut up, he growled. But this time her plan actually worked. Kent leaned over her and held her face between his hands. For a moment she thought he might strangle her. God knows she deserved it. Instead, he leaned over and planted the most uncertain kiss she could imagine against her lips. When he backed away, she was grinning from ear to ear. Kent was still pretending to be angry. Feel better? She continued smirking. Yes, he huffed, his face disagreeing with his words. Good, she grinned, inviting him to sit beside her comfortably on the couch. Just to guarantee his understanding, she added, Not a sign. Didn't think it was, he sighed, still holding on to something from before. Can I have you be excited for me? She asked, not giving him time to mope. He shrugged, the faintest trace of joy returning to his gorgeous face. Sure. Like he had done to her, she put both hands against his cheeks and leaned in as close as she could without touching him. I'm finally playing varsity this weekend. Then she snuck a peck against his mouth and backed away. His eyes lit up. Wait, actually? She nodded, seeing the brightness in her eyes reflecting back in his. Dude, that's awesome, he grinned, eschewing another kiss for a tight hug over the shoulder. The sound of a door snapped them out of it. Kent quick to back away to the other side of the couch. Margo blushed. Oh, hey, Emma said awkwardly, emerging from her room. Am I, interrupting something? Margo turned as nonchalant as she could be. No? Why? Emma was standing there surprised, her usual winter arrangement of thick socks and leggings beneath an oversized sweater. Her hair, pulled back into a stringy bun, made her round face look even bigger than usual. Nothing, she started. I thought... Never mind. She rushed to the fridge, grabbed a container of blueberries, and rushed back to her room without saying another word. Margo turned back to Kent, who finally broke into a fit of laughter with her. At least he can still be happy for me, she thought, pushing aside the jealousy she usually had toward her sister these days. A stray hair had popped out in front of Kent's ear, so she tucked it behind to match the other side. They spent the rest of the night talking about cars. Margo hardly had an interest, but he had given her the respect of celebrating her victory on the ice, and given how much support he had shown her already that season, figured he deserved as much respect to his passions too. If he had no one else to share in that joy, at least she could provide that. As his friend. That made it all the worse when the following night she was forced to interact with Johnny, who painfully reminded her of everything she had done wrong. Furious as she was afterward, storming off to be alone and get some much-needed rest, Johnny's misguided apology fueled her anticipation for Saturday's game. And as soon as she hit the ice, she was ready to tear the Japanese side apart, piece by piece. It was midway through the second period when one of their forwards, a bigger girl named Song, started encroaching too far into Margo's territory. It started with the usual screen in front of the net, which forced Margo to push her aside with her usual corral move. The girl was heavier than she had expected, and no sooner had she pushed her out of the way than the girl returned, sneaking around the far post. Clear! Hannah Peterson, their goalie, was yelling, demanding Margo make the play visible. Working on it, she thought angrily. Her neck shove came off more aggressive, and she was lucky the referee had not called her for a cross-check. Surprised by the strike, Song shoved back, nearly knocking Margo off her feet. Margo responded with both fists to the girl's shoulders, which led to Song responding the same. Luckily, the play bounced out of the zone, and both girls were forced to redirect their attention down ice. You two, the back referee called as they skated off. Next time I'm calling you both. Margo headed to the bench for a breather, only to be met with the same warning from Coach Klein. Control yourself, Margo reminded herself. The feeling lasted only a minute more. Back on the ice, so too was Song, and with a dump into her defensive zone, Margo found herself pinned in the corner along with 3 other girls she could not identify, all trying to dig the puck out from between her skates. Finally, the play cleared, though only as far as the blue line. Margo remained down in the corner defending the pass to Song. Then she felt her left foot buckle beneath her, and she crumpled to the ice. Song skated off undefended toward the net, barely missing a tap-in on the open side of the goal. The referee was paying Margo no attention. Two can play at that game, she huffed, knowing full well Song had slew-footed her behind the referee's back. The puck bounced back toward the corner, and as Song came to challenge for it, Margo redirected her attention, shifting her body weight and letting the girl skate directly into her shoulder. The referee's arm shot up immediately. 16 blue, the official sentenced at the sound of the whistle. 2 minutes for checking. Margo could hardly argue. It was a correct call, though she had hoped the referee would stay blind to her move as she had done for Song's. As she skated by her bench to the penalty box, she could hear Casey screaming the word stupid in her direction. Margo's penalty never reached fruition. Halfway through, a Japanese breakout caught one of their defensemen by surprise, leading to a power play goal. They were still up 4-2, but Margo's hand in letting the opposition cut into the deficit came with a handful of chirps when she returned to the bench. "Take a seat for the rest of the period," Casey ordered. "That was piss poor, Drrier." Margo didn't see the ice for another 10 minutes of play, by which point they were well into the final period of the game. As soon as she recognized her back on the ice, Song was quick to return to pestering her, no doubt looking to draw another penalty. "Don't engage with her," Blair warned at the next breakout, as if Margo needed reminding. Thankfully, she was able to redeem her mistake the following shift. When deep in the offensive zone, she faked a slapshot to find Maria Cargill wide open on the right side of the net, extending their lead. "At least I'm even," she thought, making her way back to the bench. Coach Casey had other impressions. Despite their victory, she was irate when the team returned to the locker room, pulling Margo aside and repeating the same warning she had given her between periods. "I don't care that you made up for it," she said at one point during the conversation. "If I see you lured into a trap like that again, you're never staying up on varsity. What happened to consistency, huh?" Margo found herself the subject of stares and glares from the other girls in the shower, much as she had been at the start of the season. None had been that welcoming to her inclusion before the game, but apparently the penalty had been worse than she realized. Her attitude fell by the time she was clean and dry, worrying that her stupidity had done enough damage to revoke her place for the next game. Mrs. Guerin's encouragement afterward helped to reinforce her confidence, but all conscious thought about the game was interrupted as soon as she and Kent stepped outside to see Johnny parading his new car. Realizing too late what the vehicle would do to Kent, she tried to put herself between the boys, but Johnny only made things worse, offering the thing to Kent like he was donating to charity. How Johnny could know about Kent's financial difficulties, she had no idea, but the fact he was flaunting the inheritance he had earned from Wyatt's death after having the audacity to apologize for it the night before infuriated Margo beyond repair, and she stormed off the same as Kent. Unfortunately, he had already holed up in Wyatt's old room back in the common room, and despite her best efforts, she could not convince him to open the door. She finally relented and locked herself in her own room, knowing that if she were still in the open when Emma or Johnny returned, she would struggle to stop herself ripping one of them to shreds. Proof of a god calmed her by way of her bedroom television. The Avalanche demolished the Canadians that night. Without a reply from Kent, she eventually found the peace to close her eyes. Kent disappeared the next day. Somehow Riley and Emma were back on speaking terms enough to go to church together in the morning, leaving Siobhan the only person Margo could talk to without calling up someone outside the squad. The girls ate a simple breakfast over at the school, midway through which Siobhan shared the news that Emma had apologized to both her and Riley the night before. "And you just forgave her?" Margo scoffed, incensed. "Of course I did," Siobhan returned, almost emotionless. "I'm Mormon, remember?" Margo was too exhausted to argue or bring up what she and Johnny had done the day before. Siobhan's inability to hold a grudge was barely human. She would never understand why Margo and Kent felt the way they did. She allowed Siobhan to stick by her side out of necessity that Sunday, both girls heading over to Xander's house that afternoon. If nothing else could cheer her up, spending time with Lisa and Walker was usually a guarantee, if only to see how much the baby had grown since her last time over. While he had his father's eyes and smile, Walker's chubby infant face was a far cry from Xander's sunken, gaunt features, a realization that made Margo smile for the first time all day, knowing his effect could change that. Unlike most times she had come over to help, he was home today, making the old house more crowded than she was used to. This gave Xander and his wife the freedom to tidy up the place while the girls watched the baby, though, and for the most part the couple trusted them enough by this point to leave them alone together. Seeing the exhaustion on Lisa's face, she needed it. "Do you girls need anything?" she offered, looking ready to fall asleep standing. "I think we're good, Mrs. Zander," Siobhan replied kindly. "All right," Lisa added. "Well, I'm going to head upstairs for a bit and try to close my eyes. Clark's in the kitchen if you need anything." "Sounds good," Margo smiled, dangling a set of plastic keys over Walker's head. "And if he looks like he's getting sleepy, feel free to grab up Clark," Lisa continued. "It's been a while since he did nap time." "No worries," Siobhan dismissed. "You should get some sleep. We've got him." Walker was able to roll himself from his back to his stomach now, though getting his head off the floor without help was still a struggle. Margo's favorite new skill was his smiling, which had been far more random her last time over. Siobhan was playing peekaboo with the baby, each time garnering an enormous belly laugh that put every other worry in her life at ease. After 20 minutes of play, Walker started to cry, and Margo picked up the baby to rock him and feed him into silence. His stomach must have grown since last time, too. He downed the bottle in a matter of minutes before passing out in her arms in a lactose-heavy coma. Siobhan was sitting in Xander's rocker, only now noticing that the baby had fallen asleep. "That was quick," she joked. "Do you want me to get Xander?" Margo shook her head. "No, let him have his break," she defended. "Lisa said it was his turn for a nap time," Siobhan recalled. "He'll have plenty of nap times," Margo argued. "Let them both have a break. I've got this one." "All right," Siobhan allowed, tossing an embroidered burp cloth to Margo, who tucked it into her bra like a bib and laid down on the living room couch, letting Walker rest face down against her chest. "You need anything?" Siobhan asked before Margo could shut her eyes. "I'm good," she smiled, settling against the pillow and letting her heartbeat match the baby's breathing. No other feeling in the world could match it. In her dream, it was her baby asleep against her chest. She hardly ever thought of the boy they had named Jason, but something felt different this time. He looked just like his father, right down to the leopard spots in the infant's thin blonde hair. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked over at the recliner where Siobhan had been only moments before. Wyatt was there, passed out with his mouth wide open in a cutting parody of how her father had looked so many times during her youth. Seeing him alive forced a scream deep within her, unable to reach the surface. Still, it was nothing to the mix of hope and panic that overwhelmed her when she looked to the far side of the room. Near Xander's front door, her sister Renee was arguing with the namesake of her child. Her brother Jason now stood 11 years old, looking even more the image of their dad. The words spitting between them sounded French, but for the first time in her life, Margo only heard them as gibberish. As she turned her head and body to sit up from the couch, the pair noticed her, and immediately switched to English. Her sister would be 13 now. 5 years removed from the last time she'd seen her, Renee looked like an entirely new person. Still recognizable, but no longer the defenseless girl whose screams continued to wake her dreams like these. Her toothless smile had filled itself during that time, and she allowed it to show as she stared back at Margo. "Hey," she said, a word she had never used between them before. "You're finally awake." "What are you doing here?" Margo wanted to ask, but no words found their way past her lips. "Cute baby," her brother congratulated. "I like his name." "Where have you been?" she tried, but still nothing. "I think she needs some more sleep," Renee considered. It was surreal hearing them speak only English, but even when she tried Quebecois, the words failed to form. Margo stood to her feet, clutching her baby to her chest, nearly in tears as her overwhelming emotions mixed with her frustrating limitations. As she opened her mouth to speak again, a figure stepped into the room from Xander's kitchen, and Margo screamed. Dressed in her usual pajama top cover, her mother walked to confront her faster than Margo could react, swiping the baby from her hands and shaking her head. Her mother had never spoken English, so this time in French she snapped her hand in Margo's face. "Loud noises will wake him. You do not want to wake him. Give him back," she tried, but the scream remained the only sound she could make. Her mother continued shaking her head. "I'll take care of him," she promised, moving back to the kitchen and out of sight. Again Margo screamed. When she looked back, her siblings were gone. In the chair where Wyatt had been asleep, Siobhan was snoring in his place. "Mama, no!" she screamed, and a jolt of electricity shot through her body. Her eyes snapped open, and Siobhan was standing over the couch with a horrified concern on her face. "Margo, are you all right?" she asked, panicked. Walker was missing from her chest. Margo snapped upright, understanding full well her scream had woken the neighborhood. "Where is she?" she shrieked. Xander poked his head around the corner of the kitchen, the baby asleep in his arms. "Margo, are you all right?" He repeated Siobhan's words. Margo rushed toward him. "Give him to me!" she demanded. She reached out for Walker, but Xander pulled his shoulder away defensively. "Margo, stop it!" he ordered. "Xander, give him to me!" she screeched, reaching toward him again. "Margo!" came Siobhan's voice behind her. Feeling a hand against her shoulder, she pushed back and heard Siobhan collide with a cabinet. "Jesus Christ, Margo!" Xander shouted. "Get a hold of yourself!" She made another lunge, desperate to feel Walker against her. She hadn't realized her claws were extended. Narrowly avoiding having his arm slashed, Xander reached his free arm beneath hers and shoved her chest as hard as he could. Margo went flying over Siobhan, tripping on the corner of the stairs and colliding with a wall. Walker was screaming. "Get out of my house!" Xander was shouting. Still disoriented from her dream, Margo clutched at the back of her head, realizing it had dented the drywall. "Xander," she breathed, needing to break the nightmare in which she still maintained a foot. "Out of my house!" he repeated, incensed. "Both of you, now!" Lisa was halfway down the stairs. "Clark, what happened?" she asked groggily, but clearly concerned. "Take him," he commanded, stepping in front of the stairs and passing her the screaming baby. Then he spun around and held out his arms, a wall between Margo and his family. When she finally realized what had happened, they were halfway back to the common room on the monorail. Siobhan was still asking her to explain things, but Margo kept her mouth shut, struggling to piece the afternoon together herself. Finally, Siobhan pulled away and began furiously texting someone, no doubt Riley or Xander, to one explaining how much of a psychopath Margo was, to the other furiously apologizing on said psychopath's behalf. She nearly put a hole in her own wall back in her bedroom. Her mother would be waiting for her as soon as she closed her eyes, mocking her with the ghost of the child who had never lived. The therapy that had eased the reality for months was gone now. She was certain Xander and Lisa would never let her anywhere near their son again. The rage and frustration inside her had nowhere to go, no way to release itself. So Margo collapsed onto the cement floor and cried. There was no one to comfort her now. No one to protect her from herself. Hours passed before she even had the strength to rise to her feet, at which point the tear stains had reverted her face to that empty shell she was growing used to. Her snow-white skin hung off her bones like the wrappings of a corpse. Her scars looked worse than ever. There was nothing left of her. No reason to even try to apologize. Every person in her life she had hurt or destroyed. It was best for everyone if she just disappeared. Not sure of her intentions, she knew of Emma's trick, and trusted in it to at least break her away from the current state of existence. An unopened bottle of melatonin pills was buried deep in her travel bag, untouched since Wendy had packed them the summer prior. Margo stopped counting the pills after 7, forcing them down her throat before punching the light switch and burying herself deep beneath her covers. Her claws were extended, waiting to strangle her mother as soon as she passed into that other world. The last thing she had expected was to wake up without dreams, but her eyes would not remain closed beyond 5:30. Thankfully, it had been the hardest, most restful sleep she had endured in months. She hopped out of bed wide awake, not bothering to see her reflection in the mirror on her way to the shower. That morning was Grace's funeral, giving her an excuse to avoid Xander and the rest of the squad, even if it meant sitting through another few hours of broken glares from the rest of the hockey team. She'd never been to Our Lady of the Valley, one of the 2 Catholic churches in town, but having experience from Mark Guerin's funeral back in August, managed to handle herself better than half the other girls. Blair kept glancing nervously around the place, like at any second she might burst into flames. Grace was the third of 6 kids, and sat in the front row a woman with thick black curls sobbed beneath a veil. Maddie and Christine were in the row behind, both struggling to keep in their emotions at the sight of the undersized casket. A horrific feeling pulled at Margo's gut as she pictured her siblings again, both approaching their service years with the company, and wondered if she would be allowed to see them then, if the unthinkable ever happened. They all ate together in the reception hall after, and despite the upcoming game against Sweden that weekend, the coaches gave the team the evening off to reflect on the morning, and the game just passed. That was all the better, Margo thought, as she had fallen dramatically behind in more than just anatomy. Better still, the day away from Kent had pushed him to speak to her again once the squad was done with training. Still upset about Johnny's car stunt, he was more concerned with Margo's state of mind. Siobhan had unsurprisingly shared her perspective with the rest of the squad at some point during the day. Even with Kent firmly on her side, she struggled to communicate her side of the story. It's been a tough few weeks, he argued in her defense, and that seemed to still the tension in the room. Kent was determined to take his test again and pass as soon as the squad was back in town, resuming their discussion from the previous week about his choice of car, both what he could afford and what he would buy with the funds of someone like Johnny. Margo nearly joked that Kent was only infatuated with Emma for her family's money, but thought better of it. She'd missed him too much to put him in another foul mood. Instead, she put her head on his shoulder and let herself drift into semi-consciousness, listening to him talk until everyone else was asleep. Tuesday, she was finally forced to see Xander again, though he did his best to make it appear that there was nothing awkward between them. In fitness, the squad were up against the wall practicing climbing drills, and allowed to use her claws to her advantage. He was coaching her instructions as normal. To Margo's harsh satisfaction, Siobhan struggled with the task, falling clean on her back at least 3 times during the drill. It was not until Thursday that he even brought up Sunday afternoon. After making it through their 3rd straight day of normalcy, he stopped Margo on our way back to the locker room. "Are we ever going to address what happened?" he asked, sweat trickling down the edge of his temple. "Address what?" she questioned. "You shoved me into a wall and kicked me out of your house." Xander shook his head, irritated by her response. We're not doing this, he critiqued. You came after my kid. You know if it ever hit the ministry, they'd side with me. So what? She sighed. So what? He mimicked. Margo, I'm trying to figure out what's going on with you. You know exactly what's going on with me, she snapped. You can't take him away from me after what happened. I can do whatever I need to do in order to keep my family safe, he bludgeoned, his face matching the color of his hat. What happened between you and Wyatt doesn't affect that. You need to understand that. Fine, she hissed. Whatever, I don't care. Margo, he reached, but she kept walking toward the locker room. Have fun in Arizona. All 6 of them left that evening. The squad for their mission, Margo for Sweden. Despite the short week, Margo's mistake had not been enough to push her off the varsity squad. Much to the frustration of the upperclassmen, she'd replaced Sasha Bachmeyer's original spot, with Maddie shifting over to play the spot of Tawny Lita, another defenseman turned forward. It meant a new set of roommates for the trip abroad, the only thing causing Margo any anxiety for the trip. That left Emma alone to stay behind and guard the place, though she would have almost certainly spent the weekend at the mansion. On their way out the door, she made sure to let Johnny know how much he'd be missed, much to the combined disgust of the rest of the squad. Halfway down the hall, Margo and Kent fell behind, letting the others turn the corner to the elevator. What do you say? She petitioned. Quick one for the road? Kent smirked and shook his head. Nah, he replied. I'm making you wait. Fair enough, she smiled, still permitting herself to squeeze him as tight as she could. They rejoined with the others, then split at the front doors, the rest of the squad turning east to the training center for last-minute checks, Margo south to the school to join the bus to the airport. She gave none of the others anything beyond a simple goodbye. She found a seat on the bus next to Jessa Lauer. She hardly knew the girl, but it was obvious she had few friends, too. Thankfully, she was not interested in expanding that sphere with Margo, allowing the pair to sit in silence the entire way to the airport. Much like the mission, she'd be taking a quick flight down to Denver before hopping commercial jets to their various layovers, though instead of the squad helicopters, their size required the immediate use of planes. She stayed put beside Jessa before finding herself assigned on the flight from Denver to New York, between Krista Nash and Allie Franklin, 2 junior defense who were also destined to be her roommates. The pair had made clear their feelings toward Margo since day 1 of the season, amplified by her penalty the last game, which affected their personal stats. With every subtle action they could, they made it known on the flight how irritating they would make her life that weekend, refusing to even let her pass to use the bathroom until she threatened to lose her bladder there in the seat. They had 2 more stops before finally landing in Lugnskog, Zurich and Stockholm. When they finally reached the Swedish hub city, the sun was clear up in the sky, the calendar showing Friday morning. Despite this, Margo had hardly slept, much to the courtesy of her new roommates. Added to their trio was Hannah Peterson, who, despite being the senior of the group, made things even worse for Margo than the other 2. First was her refusal to keep the blinds of their hotel shut. Their window looking directly south over the forest that covered the city like a green avalanche, Margo could see the sun even when she closed her eyes. Not that they had much time to rest. The other girls spent their 3 hours of relaxation pre-gaming far earlier than usual, and in the cramped Scandinavian design of their room, there was nowhere to escape the sounds of Hannah stretching her legs out of their airline stiffness. Doing the math, Margo had been awake for all but 30 minutes of the previous 29 hours. Desperate not to let her exhaustion show, or worse, become a shortened temper on behalf of her teammates, Margo spent the last 30 minutes before their trek down in the lobby, bouncing between sips of straight black coffee and water, assisted by assorted fruits. She was the first ready when the coaches came to gather the girls, followed soon after by the rest of the team. Lugnskog was a small town compared to most of the hub cities she had been to so far. Nestled way up in the northern part of Sweden, the swirl of pines that permeated the scattered buildings were the only trees she could see in any direction, the horizon cut off by a ring of mountains in the distance. This time of year, even without much snow on the ground, it was freezing. Thankfully, their bus was able to pull right in front of the hotel, and after a quick drive through the heart of town, they exited at the ice arena, a low-topped building with yellow stone walls to match the rest of the town. The rink was the smallest they had played in all season, a single strip of wooden seats adorning the glass opposite the benches. Beyond the far end, the Swedish girls were already warming up in the limited space between the boards and the building's back wall. High above them, the flags of Denmark and Finland flanked the blue and yellow she had been expecting, representing the 3 hockey powerhouses which fed this branch. Margo still had yet to adjust to play the second game, spending the 2 hours struggling to keep herself awake beyond freezing in her blue sweatsuit, while the JV squads battled it out in the undercard. Her headphones were struggling to connect to her phone, and she finally gave up on the comfort of her Bluetooth to fall back to her earbuds, which did nothing to block the arena music. Every country had its quirk, but Margo had never been more exhausted by Europop in her life. Finally, the other varsity girls began their warm-ups, giving Margo fuel for a competitive edge. Back in the locker room, she smiled at the sight of their white away uniforms hanging above their bags. It was her first time wearing the color as a part of the upper team. She tried not to let the other girls see, embarrassed that Krista and Allie might take notice and somehow use it against her after the game, especially if the result failed to go their way. All the girls around her dressed to match. Margo heard the final buzzer of the first game and closed her eyes, taking a breath to savor the moment. Apart from the blare of Avicii, Sweden had no bells and whistles ahead of the game the way the other teams did. Even during the anthems, the lights remained on, bathing the rink in an uncanny shade of yellow that bounced harshly between the brick walls and the white ice below. Margo sprayed water in her face to stay focused, eventually reaching for a salt pack at Casey's feet to keep herself ready for her first shift. Right from the go, it was a far different game from Japan. The Swedes were fast, zipping from end to end in a flurry of yellow and blue that made it hard to determine which of the three weavers had controlled the puck. The first line of defense made a sturdy effort, but when the lines changed, Maddie Tuck was caught flat-footed on a breakout, and a small Finnish girl named Una Luukkonen buried one straight between Hannah's legs. The coaches unwilling to let Margo's line take a draw, she waited for the next offensive rush to take her first steps on the ice. A quick, pitiful excuse for a shift that saw possession immediately switch to the defensive end, forcing Hannah to make 5 more saves as Margo and her defensive partner struggled to control rebounds. Hearing an earful upon their return to the bench, she's glad at least to hear the shouting directed at someone else, too. By the end of the period, the score had launched to 3-1 in favor of the Swedes. Margo struggled to hear anything Coach Klein had to say, with Zara Larson blaring from the speaker directly overhead. Straight off the draw to start the second, Alicia Göransson zipped straight through the first line and extended the lead to 3. No longer set on their face-off rule, Margo was pushed onto the ice ahead of Maddie, much to the surprise of both girls. The only command from the coaches, to do something. Margo found the face-off one back onto her stick, and not seeing anywhere clean to put the puck, took it herself through the neutral zone before ripping a shot at the net. It sailed directly into the goaltender's glove, who put it back in play immediately for her own defense. The Swedes set up another weaving rush, during which Margo found her stick knocked out of her hands without reason by the right wing, Danson. She continued into the play without it, using her size as her only tool to protect the play until she could return to the bench. Thankfully, one of the American forwards managed to flip it to her while the puck was in the opposite corner, and Margo returned to battle with Danson in front of the net, the other girl completely at her mercy. She found herself returning to the ice more times than she had anticipated, the coaches clearly trusting her so far not to give up the goals the other lines had. Each time she found herself pitted against Danson or Luukkonen, neither of whom had the size to get beyond Margo so long as she kept her feet moving. It was not until the end of the second period that her imposition on their game plan pushed them over the edge, when Danson backed his shoulder into Margo, only to have Margo shove her clean to the ice. There was no call from either referee, but the Swedish bench and the fans in attendance had clearly noticed. A veil of insults hit the ice, though since they were in Swedish, Margo failed to understand if they were directed at her or the ref. In her final shift of the period, Luukkonen tried the same move, though Margo was unable to push her off her feet as easily. Irritated by the lack of movement, Luukkonen whipped her stick down atop Margo's and shattered the shaft in 2. Margo sighed, dropping the splinters in the same motion as she grabbed the other girl's stick and ripped it clean out of her hands, throwing it into the corner. Again, there was no call, and this time the crowd was incensed. Margo took a perverse glee in the attention, though she was unprepared for the other girl to retrieve her stick and immediately whipped Margo with it in the back of the leg. When she finally limped to the bench, the girl had been issued a major penalty with intent to injure, leaving her in the penalty box for the next 10 minutes of play. Her helmet off on the other side of the glass, she was practically foaming at the mouth with insults. Margo simply raised her hand and mocked her, pinching her glove like a puppet. "Drier, knock it off," Klein warned. "You got lucky with that call. You keep it up, someone's going to get hurt." She kept her mouth shut, knowing better than to argue. Instead, she maintained her focus on the ice, occasionally turning her head to find the girl glaring back at her inside the box. The next period, Margo returned to the ice, Luukkonen still serving time. The penalty pushed Danson to cover both shifts, and despite her early fatigue, her intensity never wavered, maintaining her desire to irritate Margo every chance she could. By this point, the Swedes were up 6-3, leaving the American game plan disjointed and barely functional. On multiple perfect passes, Margo's target had given up on the play, sending the puck back into their defensive zone and forcing Hannah to continue her marathon. Finally, Margo blocked a shot directly off her knee pad on her 4th shift. The puck had hit the perfect spot. She didn't feel a thing beyond the energy of the play, and the puck ricocheted directly between the opposing defense for an open breakaway. Despite her lack of speed, she was perfectly positioned to beat them to it, finding her way 10 feet in front of the goalie with a chance to slim the lead. Her brain completely stopped working. Locked in her path, Margo failed to do anything with the puck, instead shoving her stick directly into the goalie's pads before failing to stop her own momentum. The two girls collided, sending up shouts of disapproval from the bench and the stands. The referee called it a goal. So incensed by the play, one man in the crowd threw a bottle onto the ice, forcing one official to turn his attention to the stands and toss the man from the building. Margo managed to skate past the Swedish players on the ice without incident, though their coach was hurling obscenities at her in English. Skating by the penalty box, Margo turned to Lugnskog and winked. "Your mother's a whore!" the girl screamed through the glass. "Sit down," she heard Casey order over her shoulder. "I scored," she argued. "You bodied their tendy," the coach argued back. "They're going to kill you if you go back on the ice." Margo wanted to spit at her coach's feet, instead directing the flame over the half wall. She was forced to watch the next 3 minutes, during which Lugnskog was finally allowed to return to the ice, immediately taking the puck between the first line of defense and scoring her second of the game. On her way back to her own bench, she directed a line of her own spit directly over the American side, missing Margo entirely and hitting Coach Klein, only to be called for an unsportsmanlike conduct and kicked off the ice for the remainder of the game. The crowd was furious. Margo kept her composure, hardly even reacting to the spitting incident in the hopes that Casey might let her back on the ice for one more shift. Her opportunity came a minute later, when fresh off an exhausting 2-minute-long stretch, the first line subbed with Maddie Tuck and her partner. Less than 10 seconds in, Maddie was up against the wall with Danson, when the latter girl cheap-shotted the butt end of her stick beneath Maddie's ribs, well out of sight of the referees, but clearly visible to both benches. The Swedes won the puck from the scrum, only to dump it in the zone. The wind pulled from her system. Maddie staggered toward the bench, hardly able to breathe. "Derriere, go!" Casey's voice urged behind her. Margo hopped over the boards and rushed into the zone, watching the Swedes set up a final attack. Danson was parked in the corner, the puck circling the other side of the ice. The pass came exactly where Margo hoped it would. Skating out to the open puck, Danson never had a chance to see Margo coming. With no regard for the aftermath, Margo lowered her shoulder directly into the girl's chin, sending her flying into the boards. She struggled to remember what happened then. More things were thrown over the boards. Both benches cleared. She doubted they even finished the game, but by that point Margo had been sent off to the locker room, no doubt suspended for at least the next game. Casey had followed her as a security precaution. The referees worried her safety might be at risk given the severity of the crowd. As soon as they were in the room, alone with the door shut, Casey hurled a handful of her own obscenities in Margo's direction. "You're done," was all she could remember. "You're done." She didn't remember taking off her gear. The shower she must have taken while the other girls returned to their lockers. She didn't remember their reactions, or their insults, or anything anyone said to her on the drive back to the hotel. Kent hadn't texted her yet, but remembering the time difference, she figured their mission was still ongoing. As soon as they were done, she would be desperate to see him again. He would understand. And if he didn't, she'd make him. She didn't remember returning to the hotel. The coaches forced her to stay on the bus while they issued their immediate punishment. She couldn't remember what that punishment was. All she remembered was forcing her way back into the room, disregarding the girls while she grabbed her bag and stormed into the bathroom, locking herself inside. She held herself over the sink, the round mirror staring back at her as she gripped the edges of the bowl. It didn't matter what would happen. It didn't matter. For the first time in months, she had done something, really done something, of her own accord. Who cared about the consequences? No one was controlling her anymore. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this powerful. Her hair was still wet from the shower, hanging over her shoulders in a tight spectrum of golden curls. Her eyes were sharp as they'd ever looked, a bloodshot frenzy to them that only fed her confidence. Out of curiosity, she pulled up her shirt, staring into the mirror at her white stomach. Not a blemish in sight. Margo turned, watching herself from every angle, her demented grin widening with every degree of the swivel. So what if they cut me? She thought. Look at me. It didn't matter if they hated her for it. It didn't matter if every girl in that locker room shunned her for the rest of high school. Who were they to her? The same went for those 3 bitches who would be coming back to share her room. She could spend the entire night in the bathroom if she had to. That's exactly what I'm going to do. She looked incredible. It almost broke her heart to know why it had never seen her this good. That's the last thing they take from me, she committed. Her brother, her sister, Riley, even Emma had turned against her. And if they took hockey away too, so be it. They were never going to take her confidence again. The mirror was small, but she wrestled for minutes finding the perfect angle. Her hair, her shirt, her knee popped out just the slightest bit to counter her hip on the other side, so he could see exactly how perfect she looked tonight. She knew he'd let her know it. She pulled out her phone, clicked on the ghost, and snapped the picture solely to Kent_Delvecchio. I miss you.